The bone cracked like a gunshot in the desert silence. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb's scream tore through the training yard as his femur jutted through torn camouflage, white against the crimson spreading beneath him. Above him, Private Jessica Chen stood motionless, her knuckles still bloody from the impact that had shattered both bone and his arrogance. 20 minutes earlier, he had laughed at her tears during combatives training, his voice cutting through. The Arizona heat. Real soldiers don't cry, sweetheart. Now as medics rushed across the sand and his own sobs echoed off the barracks walls, she finally spoke, her voice steady as steel. You're right, Sergeant. They don't. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had not yet crested the jagged peaks of the Sonoran Mountains when Private First Class Jessica Chen laced her combat boots in the pre-dawn darkness. The leather was still stiff from the previous day's sweat, salt stains mapping the hours she had spent under the Arizona sun. Her fingers worked the eyelets with practiced efficiency, each pull of the laces a ritual that anchored her to purpose. The barracks around her stirred with the quiet movements of soldiers preparing for another day in hell. Fort Valdez stretched across 20,000 acres of desert scrubland, a collection of tan buildings and training grounds, carved from land that had once belonged only to scorpions and coyotes. The morning air carried the scent of creosote and dust, tinged with the metallic smell of equipment and the faint diesel exhaust from generators that had hummed through the night. Jessica stood and adjusted her CUs, the digital camouflage pattern, crisp despite the countless washings. The American flag on her right shoulder caught the fluorescent light from the overhead fixture, its colors muted in the artificial glow. She had sewn it there herself the day she arrived at Valdez, her mother's steady voice echoing in her memory as she worked the needle. Straight lines. Jessie, everything you do should have straight lines. 3 months had passed since her arrival at the Advanced Combat Training Facility. 3 months of brutal desert conditioning that had stripped away everything soft from her 120-pound frame. Her reflection in the small mirror above her footlocker showed a face grown lean and angular, cheekbones sharp beneath skin darkened by constant exposure to the unforgiving sun. Her black hair, cropped regulation short, framed eyes that had learned to hide the exhaustion that came with pushing beyond human limits daily. The barracks door opened with a metallic groan, admitting a gust of cool desert air that would disappear within the hour. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos entered, her silhouette backlit by the security lights that dotted the compound. Santos had been Jessica's squad leader since arrival, a compact woman whose Puerto Rican accent carried the authority of 15 years in the Army. Her presence commanded instant attention without raising her voice above a conversational tone. Formation in 10, Santos announced, her gaze sweeping the rows of bunks where soldiers finished their morning preparations. Full kit. We're starting with combatives today. Jessica's stomach tightened at the word. Combatives training at Fort Valdez was legendary throughout the Army, a hand-to-hand combat program that pushed soldiers beyond their perceived limitations. The training mats had absorbed the sweat and sometimes blood of thousands of soldiers, each one learning that survival often came down to what could be done with bare hands when all other weapons failed. She grabbed her tactical vest from the tumdia hook beside her bunk, feeling the familiar weight of the ceramic plates that would turn a deadly rifle round into a bruising impact. The vest smelled of cordite and canvas, scents that had become as familiar as her own skin. Around her, other soldiers made similar preparations, their movements economical and purposeful. Private Tommy Martinez occupied the bunk to her left, a kid from East LA whose easy smile had survived 3 months of desert hell. He caught her eye and nodded toward the door where Santos had disappeared. Heard we're getting a new instructor today, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustle of equipment. Some hotshot from the 75th Ranger Regiment. Jessica nodded but said nothing. New instructors usually meant new tests, fresh opportunities to prove or disprove themselves under conditions designed to break the unprepared. She had survived every challenge Fort Valdez had presented, but survival was not the same as acceptance. That required something more, something she was still fighting to earn. The formation area occupied a stretch of packed earth between two rows of barracks, marked by painted lines that had been refreshed countless times over the years. Soldiers filed out in groups, their boots raising small clouds of dust that caught the first rays of sunlight breaking over the eastern mountains. The air was still cool, hovering near 60 degrees, but experience had taught them all that by noon the temperature would climb past 110. Jessica found her place in formation. Third rank, second file, a position she had occupied. For weeks, the soldiers around her had become familiar faces, brothers and sisters forged by shared suffering under the desert sun. To her right stood Specialist David Park, a computer programmer from Seattle whose pale skin had burned and peeled repeatedly before finally accepting the brutal kiss of constant sunshine. Behind her, Corporal Lisa Washington from Detroit kept perfect spacing, her presence steady and reassuring. The formation snapped to attention as Santos emerged from the company headquarters, followed by a figure that immediately commanded attention. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb moved with the fluid confidence of a predator, his frame broad and powerful beneath his ACS. At 6'3" and 220 pounds, he dwarfed most of the soldiers in formation, his presence filling space with an almost physical weight. Webb's face was carved from granite, all sharp angles and hard lines beneath close-cropped brown hair. His eyes, pale blue and predatory, swept the formation with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to finding weakness and exploiting it. The combat infantry badge on his chest was flanked by airborne wings and a ranger tab, credentials, that spoke of elite training and battlefield experience. "Listen up," Santos began, her voice cutting through the morning air. "Staff Sergeant Webb comes to us from the 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. He's here to upgrade your combatives training, which means some of you are about to learn things about yourselves you didn't know." Webb stepped forward, his movements smooth and predatory. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat accent of rural Montana, each word delivered with precision. "Combatives isn't about fighting fair," he began, his gaze moving across the formation. "Like a searchlight. It's about staying alive when someone wants you dead. Some of you think you know how to fight because you grew up hard, got into scraps in high school, maybe threw hands in a bar." He paused, letting his words settle like dust. "You don't know shit. Real combat is ugly, desperate, and decided in seconds. The enemy doesn't care if you're tired, scared, or hurt. They want to kill you, and the only thing standing between you and a body bag is your willingness to be more violent, more determined, and more ruthless than they are." Jessica felt the words like physical blows, each one designed to strip away comfort and illusion. Around her, she sensed the formation's subtle shift, spines straightening, shoulders squaring as soldiers absorbed the reality of their chosen profession. "We'll start with basic positions and escapes," Webb continued, then progress to joint manipulation and striking techniques. "By the end of this rotation, you'll know how to break bones, dislocate joints, and inflict damage designed to end fights permanently." The sun climbed higher as the formation moved to the combatives' training area, a section of the compound dominated by thick blue mats arranged in fighting squares. The rubber surface was scarred from years of abuse, marked by boot prints, and stained with sweat from thousands of previous training sessions. Shade structures provided minimal relief, their canvas stretched taut between metal poles that radiated heat like small furnaces. Webb divided the formation into pairs. His assignments, seemingly random, but Jessica suspected based on careful observation of each soldier's build and bearing. She found herself paired with Specialist Janet Torres, a supply clerk from Phoenix whose slight frame concealed surprising strength, developed through months of desert training. "We'll start with guard position," Webb announced, positioning himself. In the center of the mats where every soldier could observe. One fighter on their back, the other between their legs. The guard is a defensive position, but it can become offensive if you know what you're doing. He demonstrated with Santos as his partner, his movements fluid and economical as he showed. Proper hip positioning and grip placement. Jessica watched intently, memorizing each detail even as sweat began to gather beneath her tactical vest. The morning heat was building, and she knew that within an hour the mats would become furnaces. That tested endurance as much as skill. The training began with basic positioning, soldiers learning to maintain guard and work for submissions. Jessica moved through the drills with methodical precision, her engineering background helping her analyze the mechanical principles behind each technique. Leverage, angles, and timing. Combatives was physics applied to human anatomy, force multiplied through knowledge and applied with surgical precision. Webb moved among the pairs, correcting positioning and offering guidance with the patient. Intensity of someone who understood that these skills could mean the difference between life and death. Jessica noticed his attention was not evenly distributed. He seemed drawn to certain soldiers, testing them with additional pressure or more complex variations. "Shun," he called during a water break, his voice cutting through the conversations of exhausted soldiers. "You're holding back." Jessica looked up from where she knelt beside her water bottle, feeling the sudden attention of nearby soldiers. "I'm following the drill as demonstrated, Sergeant." Webb's pale eyes narrowed slightly. "You're following the drill, but you're not committing to it. In real combat, hesitation gets you killed." He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. "Maybe you're worried about hurting your partner. Maybe you don't think you're strong enough to make these techniques work." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and Jessica felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. She had heard that tone before, from drill sergeants and instructors who believed that breaking students down was the first step in building them up, but something in Webb's eyes suggested his motivations might be less professional. "I understand the importance of commitment, Sergeant," she replied, her voice steady despite the heat and exhaustion. Webb smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "We'll see. Torres, switch out. Martinez, you're with Chun." Tommy Martinez stepped forward, his usual easy smile replaced by the focused intensity that training demanded. At 5'9" and 170 pounds, he outweighed Jessica by 50 pounds, but months of training together had taught them both to adjust for size differences. "Same drill," Webb announced. "But this time, I want to see commitment. Chun, you're in guard. Martinez works for position improvement. Don't worry about hurting each other. If you can't handle a little pain, you have no business wearing that uniform." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica settled into guard position, her back on the hot rubber mat, legs wrapped around Martinez's waist. The position was defensive by design, allowing the bottom fighter to control distance and prevent strikes while looking for submission opportunities. She had drilled this position hundreds of times, her muscle memory encoding the proper angles and grips. Martinez began working to improve his position, trying to pass her guard and achieve side control or mount. Jessica responded automatically, her hips moving to maintain distance, her grips adjusting to counter his advances. The drill was familiar, practiced, but she sensed Webb's attention like a physical weight. "Pathetic," Webb's voice cut through the sound of shuffling bodies and heavy breathing. "Chun, you're playing patty cake. This isn't a dance, it's preparation for war." Jessica felt heat that had nothing to do with the desert sun rise in her chest. She had never been accused of lacking commitment or intensity, had never been found wanting in her dedication to becoming the soldier the army needed. But Webb's words carried the sting of public humiliation. Delivered in front of soldiers who had shared every hardship and triumph of the past months. She increased the pressure of her guard, pulling Martinez closer, making his attempts to pass more difficult. Her grips tightened, and she began to actively look for submission opportunities, an armbar, perhaps, or a triangle choke. The shift in intensity was immediate, and Martinez responded by increasing his own pressure. Better, Webb acknowledged. But his tone suggested the improvement was minimal. But still not enough. In Afghanistan, the Taliban won't give you time to think, won't let you ease into the fight. They'll try to kill you from the first second, and if you're not ready to match that intensity, you'll die. The mention of Afghanistan hung in the air like heat shimmer. Every soldier at Fort Valdez knew that deployment was inevitable, that the skills they learned here would soon be tested in mountain valleys, where the enemy showed no mercy to those unprepared for the reality of close combat. Jessica's world narrowed to the feel of the mat against her back, the weight of Martinez above her, and the growing certainty that Webb was testing something beyond her technical proficiency. She could feel the attention of other soldiers. Their training paused as they sensed the undercurrent of challenge in the instructor's words. The drill continued for 20 minutes, positions rotating as soldiers practiced guard maintenance, guard passing, and basic submissions. The sun climbed higher, turning the training area into a furnace that sapped energy with each breath. Sweat soaked through uniforms and dripped onto rubber mats that grew slick and treacherous. Webb called for a break, and soldiers gratefully reached for water bottles, their faces flushed with heat and exertion. Jessica knelt beside her gear, letting cool water wash the salt taste from her mouth while her heart rate gradually returned to normal. The morning was still young, but she could already feel the fatigue that would build throughout the day. Interesting, Webb said, appearing beside her with the silent movement that marked professional soldiers. You've got decent technique, but I can see why you're still a private. You don't have the killer instinct. Jessica looked up, meeting his pale gaze directly. I have whatever instinct the mission requires, Sergeant. Webb's smile was sharp as a blade. The mission requires warriors, not technicians. I've seen your type before. Book smart, technically proficient, but when it comes time to get nasty, you fold. He paused, letting his words sink in. Maybe. That's why they stick females in support roles. Can't handle the reality of what war actually demands. The words hit like a physical blow, and Jessica felt something dangerous stir in her chest. She had heard similar sentiments before, whispered in barracks or spoken openly by those who believed women had no place in combat arms. But hearing it from an instructor, delivered as a professional assessment, carried different weight. I've never failed to meet a standard, Sergeant, she said carefully. Her voice controlled despite the fury building behind her ribs. Webb's laugh was harsh. Standards? You think meeting some arbitrary benchmark makes you a soldier? He gestured toward the other trainees who had grown quiet as they sensed the tension. Every one of these males could overpower you in a real fight. Size matters, strength matters, and when bullets start flying, feelings and equality don't mean shit. Jessica stood slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. Around them, the training area had grown silent, other soldiers sensing that something significant was developing. Even Santos had stopped her conversation with another instructor to watch the exchange. Then perhaps we should test that theory, Sergeant, Jessica said, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. Webb's eyes lit with something predatory and eager. Are you challenging me, Private? I'm volunteering to demonstrate the effectiveness of proper technique over raw strength, Jessica replied. If that's acceptable within the training parameters. The silence stretched like a taut wire, every soldier in the area understanding that something more than training was at stake. Webb looked around the group, noting their attention, their anticipation. His smile widened, revealing teeth as white as bleached bone. "Acceptable," he laughed. "It's exactly what we need. A reality check for those who think wishful thinking can replace biological reality." Santa stepped forward, her expression concerned. "Sergeant Webb, perhaps we should." "Should what?" Webb cut her off. "Should pretend that combat is fair, that the enemy will adjust their tactics to accommodate political correctness." He shook his head. "Private Chun wants a demonstration. I think the entire class could benefit from seeing what real intensity looks like." Jessica felt the weight of every gaze in the training area, the collective attention of soldiers who had become her brothers and sisters over months of shared hardship. Some faces showed concern, others anticipation, but all understood that whatever happened next would define something important about who they were and what they could become. The desert sun climbed higher, promising a day that would test more than physical endurance. In the growing heat, Jessica Chun faced the challenge that would either forge her into the soldier she aspired to be, or break her against the unforgiving reality of those who believed strength came only in one form. The stage was set, the players in position, and the desert waited to see which version of truth would emerge victorious from the crucible of combat. Webb circled the center mat like a heavyweight boxer sizing up an opponent, his boots silent on the rubber surface despite his considerable bulk. The other soldiers formed a loose circle around the training area, their water breaks forgotten as they sensed the electricity crackling between instructor and student. Jessica stood at the edge of the mat, her tactical vest rising and falling. With controlled breaths, her dark eyes tracking Webb's movement with the focus of a sniper acquiring a target. "Ground rules," Webb announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the training area. "Full contact grappling, no strikes. Submission or pin for 3 seconds wins." He paused, rolling his shoulders in a gesture that seemed casual, but Jessica recognized as a fighter loosening up for battle. Since Private Chun is so confident in technique over strength, she can start on bottom, worst position possible. Santu stepped forward, her expression tight with concern. "Sergeant, perhaps we should use protective gear for this demonstration." "No gear," Webb cut her off, his pale eyes never leaving Jessica. "Real combat doesn't come with padding. If Chun wants to prove a point about female capabilities in direct action roles, let's see how she handles reality." The words carried implications that extended far beyond a training demonstration. Every soldier present understood the broader debate surrounding women combat positions, the political and cultural battles being fought in Congress and Pentagon briefing rooms. Jessica had become an unwilling symbol of that struggle, her performance under Webb's challenge, a data point that would be discussed long after the desert heat faded. Jessica stripped off her tactical vest and set it aside, feeling immediately lighter but also more vulnerable. The ACU blouse beneath was soaked with sweat, the fabric clinging to her lean frame in ways that made her hyper-aware of every watching eye. She had trained in these conditions for months, but never with such focused attention, never with stakes that extended beyond personal achievement.
"You sure about this, Jessie?" Martinez whispered as she passed him, using the nickname her squad had adopted during their shared trials. "Webb's got 60 pounds on you, and he's Rangers qualified. This isn't about proving anything." Jessica met his concerned gaze with steady resolve. "It's about proving everything," she replied quietly. "Every woman who comes after me, every soldier who gets judged by appearance instead of ability. This is bigger than training." She stepped onto the mat, feeling the heat-softened rubber yield slightly under her boots. The circle of watching soldiers seemed to tighten, their faces a mixture of anticipation and concern. She had shared foxholes with these people, had crawled through obstacle courses in the mud beside them, had earned their respect through months of shared suffering. Now that respect would be tested against the brutal arithmetic of size and strength. Webb took his position standing over the center of the mat, his shadow falling across the space where Jessica would begin. "Standard guard position," he instructed, his voice taking on the professional tone of an instructor despite the personal nature of their confrontation. Chen starts on her back, I start in her guard. First to achieve a dominant position and hold for 3 seconds wins. Jessica lay back on the mat, feeling the heat radiating up through the rubber into her spine. The position was vulnerable by design, flat on her back, legs wrapped around her opponent's waist, arms free to defend but limited in their offensive capability. From this position, she would need to either sweep Webb and reverse their positions or work for a submission that could end the fight despite the significant size disadvantage. Webb settled between her legs, his weight immediately apparent. At 220 pounds of muscle hardened by ranger training and combat deployments, he was nearly twice her size. His hands found her collar, grips designed to control her posture and limit her movement. The position was legal within the rules they had established, but Jessica could feel the crushing pressure that would build if she allowed him to settle his weight on her. "Begin," Santos called, her voice cutting through the desert silence. Webb immediately drove forward, trying to flatten Jessica against the mat and pin her shoulders. His weight was enormous, a crushing force that threatened to drive the air from her lungs. Jessica responded instinctively, her hips bridging upward to prevent him from settling his full mass on her chest. Her hands found his collar, fingers digging into the fabric as she fought for grips that would give her leverage. The crowd around the mat was silent, except for the shuffle of boots as soldiers repositioned for better views. She could feel their attention like physical weight, every eye analyzing her technique, her composure, her chances against an opponent who outweighed her so dramatically.
Webb's first assault was brutal in its simplicity, pure pressure designed to overwhelm through size and strength. He drove his shoulder into her chest, his hips heavy as he tried to flatten her guard and achieve the mount position that would effectively end the contest. Jessica felt her ribs compress, her breathing becoming labored as she fought against the crushing weight. But months of desert conditioning had taught her body to function under stress, to find strength in desperation. She shifted her hips, creating angles that disrupted Webb's base, preventing him from settling into the dominant position he sought. Her legs, strengthened by countless miles of running in the desert heat, squeezed his ribs with increasing pressure. "Good pressure, Chen," she heard Torres call from the circle, her voice carrying encouragement that felt like a lifeline. "Work your angles." Webb's response was immediate and vicious. He drove his forearm across Jessica's throat, not a choke, but a painful crossface that ground bone against her windpipe. The pressure was enormous, designed to force her to abandon her defensive positions and expose herself to his attacks. Jessica's vision sparkled with the strain, but she refused to release her grips. Instead, she used his aggression against him. As Webb pressed forward with the crossface, she shifted her weight and bridged explosively, her hips driving upward with every ounce of strength her conditioning had built. The movement was perfectly timed, catching Webb as his weight was committed forward, and for a moment, his base was compromised. Jessica didn't waste the opportunity. Her right leg swung over his back as her left trapped his arm, the beginnings of a triangle choke that could end the fight if she could lock it in properly. The crowd stirred as they recognized the technique, murmurs of appreciation for the technical skill she was displaying. But Webb was too experienced to be caught by a basic attack. He recognized the danger immediately and postured up, breaking her grip and driving his weight backward to prevent the choke from tightening. His escape was textbook perfect, the kind of defensive movement that came from years of high-level training. "Not bad," Webb admitted, his breathing slightly elevated, but his voice still controlled. "But technique without strength is just theory." He immediately launched another attack, this time working to pass her guard entirely. His hands gripped her knees, trying to split them apart and create the space he needed to move to side control. Jessica fought desperately to maintain her defensive position, her legs pumping to keep him centered, her grips shifting constantly to counter his attempts.
The battle was one of inches, each fighter working for tiny advantages that could cascade into victory or defeat. Jessica's conditioning began to show as she maintained the pace, her smaller size actually working in her favor as she required less energy to maintain defensive positions. Webb was stronger, but strength required oxygen, and the desert heat was beginning to exact its toll. Minutes passed in grinding combat, both fighters drenched in sweat, their uniforms darkened and clinging. Jessica had successfully defended several pass attempts, her guard proving more resilient than Webb had anticipated. But she could feel his growing frustration, sense the shift in his tactics from technical to aggressive. "Come on, Webb!" she heard someone call from the crowd, though she couldn't identify the voice through the tunnel vision of combat. "Finish this!" The pressure from the watching soldiers was enormous, their expectations creating an additional layer of stress that threatened to break her concentration. Jessica forced herself to focus on the immediate threat, on the grips and angles that would determine the outcome of their struggle. Webb's next attack was different, more desperate. He abandoned the careful position passing techniques he had been using and simply drove forward with raw power, trying to flatten her through overwhelming force. His shoulder found her solar plexus, driving the air from her lungs in a whoosh that left her gasping. But desperation had made him vulnerable. As Webb committed his weight forward, Jessica saw the opening she had been waiting for. Her right leg swung over his back, while her left trapped his arm, but this time she adjusted for his previous escape. Instead of going for the triangle choke, she rolled to her left, using his momentum against him in a perfect sweep that reversed their positions. Suddenly, Jessica was on top, Webb's back flat against the mat, her knees planted on either side of his torso in the mount position. The reversal had happened so quickly that the watching soldiers erupted in surprised shouts, their voices carrying across the training area. "Mount!" Santos called, her voice carrying official recognition of the position change. "Chen has achieved dominant position." Jessica felt a surge of triumph, but she knew the fight was far from over. The mount was a powerful position, but holding it against a stronger opponent required constant adjustment and technical precision. Webb immediately began working to escape, his hips bucking as he tried to roll her off, his hands gripping her belt to limit her mobility. "Lucky," Webb grunted between escape attempts, his face flushed with exertion and something that might have been embarrassment. "Won't happen again."
Jessica said nothing, conserving her energy for the technical battle that was unfolding. From the mount, she had several options. She could work for submissions, maintain position for the required 3-second count, or transition to other dominant positions. But Webb's strength was formidable, his escape attempts becoming more violent as seconds ticked by. The key was staying calm, trusting her technique even as Webb's desperation increased. Jessica adjusted her base constantly, her knees squeezing his ribs as she rode out his attempts to buck her off. Her hands found grips on his collar, controlling his posture and preventing him from creating the space he needed for effective escapes. 1 second, Santos called, beginning the count that would end the demonstration. Webb's response was immediate and explosive. He bridged with everything he had, his powerful legs driving his hips upward with enough force to launch Jessica into the air. At the same time, he wrapped his arms around her waist and rolled hard to his left, using his size advantage to simply overpower her technical position. The reversal was crude but effective. Jessica found herself back on the bottom, Webb's weight settling into side control, one of the most dominant positions in grappling. His shoulder pressed into her neck, while his hip drove against her ribs, creating a crushing pressure that made breathing difficult. "My turn," Webb said, his voice carrying satisfaction and something darker. "Let's see how long technique lasts when the pressure really gets turned up." From side control, Webb had numerous options to increase his dominance. He could work for the mount, transition to north-south position, or simply maintain crushing pressure until Jessica was forced to make a desperate escape attempt that would leave her vulnerable to submission. Jessica had been in worse positions during training, but never against an opponent with such personal investment in her failure. Webb's attacks were technically sound, but delivered with a viciousness that went beyond instruction.
His shoulder ground against her jaw, his weight crushing her ribs, every movement designed to break her will as much as her defensive posture. The watching soldiers had grown quiet, sensing that the demonstration had evolved into something more personal and dangerous. Jessica could hear their breathing, feel their tension as they watched their squad-mate struggle against an opponent who seemed determined to prove a point that extended far beyond grappling technique. Minutes crawled by as Jessica fought from the bottom, her escapes consistently shut down by Webb's superior positioning and size advantage. Her conditioning was holding, but she could feel the accumulated fatigue of defending against constant pressure. Sweat stung her eyes, and her breathing was becoming labored, despite her best efforts to remain calm. Webb sensed her weakening and increased his pressure, transitioning to the mount position Jessica had held minutes earlier. But where her mount had been technical and controlled, his was heavy and punishing. He settled his full weight on her chest, his knees driving into her ribs as he worked to break her defensive posture.
"This is what real pressure feels like," Webb said, his voice low enough that only Jessica could hear. "This is why females don't belong in direct action. When it matters, when lives are on the line, technique isn't enough." Jessica's world had narrowed to the crushing weight on her chest, the burning in her lungs as she fought for each breath. Webb's position was technically perfect, his base solid, and his weight distributed in ways that made escape nearly impossible. But something in his voice, the satisfaction he took from her struggle, ignited a flame in her chest that burned hotter than the desert sun. She had not endured months of punishment in the Arizona heat to be broken by someone who confused size with worth. Every mile she had run, every obstacle she had conquered, every standard she had met or exceeded had led to this moment. The watching soldiers, her squadmates, represented more than personal reputation. They were witnesses to a test that would echo far beyond Fort Valdez. Jessica's breathing steadied despite the crushing weight. Her muscles, pushed beyond their limits by months of conditioning, found reserves she hadn't known existed. The technical knowledge drilled into her through countless hours of training began to coalesce into a plan, a sequence of movements that would require perfect timing and absolute commitment. Webb had made a mistake in his confidence. He had settled too heavily into his dominant position, too satisfied with his control to maintain the constant vigilance that technical superiority required. His weight was crushing, but it was also committed. His base solid, but potentially vulnerable to the right leverage applied at the perfect moment. Jessica's hands found new grips. Her hips began to work with subtle movements that Webb either didn't notice or didn't consider threatening. The soldiers around the mat sensed a shift in the dynamic, their attention sharpening as they watched Jessica begin to work from what appeared to be a hopeless position. The desert sun climbed higher, beating down on the training area with relentless intensity. But for Jessica Chen, pinned beneath 220 pounds of muscle and ego, the external heat was nothing compared to the fire building in her core. The demonstration that had begun as a challenge to her competence was about to become something far more significant. In the crushing embrace of Webb's mount, Jessica prepared to show everyone watching exactly what technique, will, and months of desert forging could accomplish when applied with surgical precision and absolute determination. The real test was about to begin, and failure was not an option she was prepared to accept. The stage was set for a reversal that would echo far beyond the rubber mats of Fort Valdez. A moment that would redefine what strength truly meant in the crucible of combat.
Jessica's right hand found Webb's left wrist with surgical precision, her fingers wrapping around the joint with the controlled grip of a technician calibrating delicate equipment. Beneath 220 pounds of crushing weight, her mind had achieved a crystalline clarity that transformed desperation into calculation. Every hour spent studying biomechanics in the engineering classrooms at UCLA, every night spent analyzing joint angles and leverage points, had distilled into this single moment of perfect understanding. Webb felt the grip and instinctively tried to pull his hand away, but Jessica's fingers had locked with the persistence of a mechanical vice.
Her left hand joined the grip, both palms now controlling his wrist, while her hips began a subtle rocking motion that seemed insignificant against his overwhelming positional advantage. "Still fighting?" Webb's voice carried amusement tinged with growing frustration. The demonstration had lasted longer than he had anticipated, Jessica's resistance more persistent than any female soldier he had previously encountered. "This is what I'm talking about. In real combat, the enemy won't give you time to work your little techniques." But Jessica wasn't working techniques in the traditional sense. Her engineering mind had deconstructed the mount position into its component parts. Weight distribution, points of balance, angles of leverage. Webb's dominance was built on physics, but physics could be manipulated by someone who understood the underlying principles. Her hips continued their subtle movement, not the wild bucking of an amateur trying to throw off superior weight, but the calculated adjustments of someone systematically destabilizing a structure. Each micro-movement shifted Webb's base by millimeters, creating tiny imbalances that accumulated like stress fractures in metal. Specialist Park, watching from the circle, recognized what Jessica was attempting. His engineering background allowed him to see the geometric precision of her movements, the way she was creating leverage where none should exist. "She's building a fulcrum," he whispered to Martinez, who stood beside him with growing tension. Martinez had seen Jessica work through problems before, had watched her approach obstacles with the methodical patience that characterized her entire military career. "She's not trying to power out," he realized. "She's solving him like an equation." Webb's confidence remained intact, but something subtle had shifted in the pressure he felt from beneath. His mount, which had felt solid and crushing moments earlier, now required constant minor adjustments to maintain secure. Jessica's movements weren't challenging his position directly, but they were making it work harder to stay secure.
"You're wasting energy," Webb told her, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "Every movement you make just gives me more opportunities to submit to you. This is the difference between male and female soldiers. Males understand when to accept reality." Jessica's response came not in words, but in a sudden, explosive movement that utilized every principle of leverage she had been systematically creating. Her right elbow drove into the mat as her left hand pulled Webb's captured wrist across her body, while her hips bridged with a violence that seemed to come from nowhere. The technique was called an elbow escape, but Jessica's execution transformed it from a standard defensive movement into something approaching art. Webb's carefully maintained base disintegrated in an instant, his weight shifting as leverage and timing combined to break his control. For a moment, 220 pounds of muscle became weightless, victim to physics applied with surgical precision. Jessica rolled to her left as Webb tumbled past, his solid mount position collapsing like a controlled demolition. The reversal happened so quickly that several soldiers in the watching circle gasped, their expectations shattered along with Webb's dominance. "Holy shit!" Torres breathed, her voice carrying across the suddenly electric training area. "She just—" "Technique," Park finished, his voice filled with professional appreciation. "Perfect application of mechanical advantage." Jessica came up on top, but instead of settling into the mount position Webb had occupied, she immediately transitioned to side control, her movements flowing like water, finding the path of least resistance. Her knee settled against Webb's hip, while her shoulder pressed into his neck, creating pressure that was technical rather than crushing. Webb's reaction was immediate and violent. The reversal had caught him completely off guard, shattering his confidence and exposing him to the watching soldiers in a way he had never experienced. His superior size and strength, the foundation of his entire worldview, had been rendered irrelevant by technique applied with precision. "Get off," he snarled, his voice losing its professional composure for the first time since the demonstration had begun. His hands found Jessica's collar, grips designed to pull her into his guard and restart the fight from a position where his strength advantages would matter more. But Jessica had no intention of allowing him to reset. Her transitions were fluid and constant, preventing Webb from establishing any stable defensive position. When he tried to pull her into guard, She sprawled backward and maintained side control. When he attempted to roll away, she followed, with the patience of someone who understood that pressure applied consistently was more effective than strength applied sporadically. The watching soldiers sensed a shift in dynamic, their energy changing from concern to amazement. Jessica's technical proficiency was dismantling Webb's advantages with surgical precision, each movement calculated to neutralize his strengths while amplifying her own. "She's not fighting him," Washington observed, her voice carrying new respect. "She's dissecting him." Webb's breathing became labored, not from exertion, but from the psychological pressure of finding himself dominated by someone he had dismissed as inherently inferior. His attempts to escape grew more desperate, less technical, driven by emotion rather than the calculated approach that had characterized his early attacks. Jessica recognized the shift and adjusted her tactics accordingly. Against a technical opponent, she would have maintained patience and worked for submissions methodically. But Webb's desperation created opportunities that could be exploited more directly. She transitioned to a north-south position, her hips settling over Webb's head while her hands controlled his arms. The position was suffocating, designed to create claustrophobia as much as physical dominance. Webb's struggles became more frantic, his professional composure cracking under pressure he had never anticipated. "This can't be happening," he muttered, his voice muffled by Jessica's position. The words were meant for himself, but the acoustics of combat carried them to soldiers who exchanged meaningful glances. Santos had watched the entire demonstration with growing amazement, her professional eye recognizing technical excellence when she saw it. But she also understood the broader implications of what was unfolding, the way Jessica's performance was redefining expectations for every soldier present. "Time," she called, intending to end the demonstration before it progressed beyond training into something more personal and dangerous. But Webb's pride wouldn't allow him to accept defeat, especially not in front of soldiers he was supposed to be instructing. "No!" he gasped from beneath Jessica's control. "This isn't over. She got lucky, but luck runs out." Jessica released the position and stood, her movements controlled and professional despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She had proven her point, demonstrating that technique and conditioning could overcome significant size disadvantages. The demonstration could end with dignity intact for everyone involved. "The demonstration is complete," she said formally, her voice carrying to every soldier in the watching circle. "I believe the instructional value has been achieved." But Webb wasn't finished. As he climbed to his feet, his face flushed with exertion and humiliation, something dangerous flickered in his pale eyes. The controlled aggression that characterized professional combatives training was giving way to something more personal and vindictive. "Instructional value?" Webb's voice carried an edge that made several soldiers step forward unconsciously. "The only thing this demonstrates is that technique has limits. In real combat, when adrenaline is pumping and lives are at stake, strength and aggression win." He moved to the center of the mat, his posture shifting from instructor to predator. "One more round. No time limits, no position restrictions. Let's see how your technique holds up when I stop treating you like a training partner and start treating you like an enemy." The challenge hung in the desert air like heat shimmer, distorting everything around it. Jessica recognized the shift in Webb's demeanor, the way his professional mask had slipped to reveal something more primitive underneath. This was no longer about training or instruction, it was about dominance and the validation of worldviews that went far beyond military doctrine. Santos stepped forward, her authority as squad leader compelling her to intervene. "That's enough for today. Both of you have—" "With respect, Sergeant Santos, this is about more than one training session. This is about whether feel-good policies and political correctness can override biological reality. Every soldier here deserves to know the truth before they trust their lives to someone who might not be able to protect them." The words hit like artillery shells. their implications spreading through the watching formation like shockwaves. Every soldier present understood the broader debate Webb was referencing, the ongoing struggle over women in combat roles that was being fought in Congress, in Pentagon briefing rooms, and in training areas exactly like this one. Jessica felt the weight of that larger battle settling on her shoulders. Her performance in the previous round had been about personal validation, about proving her own capabilities to herself and her squadmates. But Webb's escalation had transformed their confrontation into something symbolic, a test case that would be discussed and analyzed long after the desert dust settled. "One more round," she agreed, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was accepting. "Same rules, no time limits." The soldiers around the mat seemed to hold their collective breath, sensing that what came next would define more than individual reputations. Martinez caught Jessica's eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of support that carried months of shared hardship and mutual respect. Webb smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "This time, no more games. No more holding back because you're female. I'm going to show everyone watching what happens when reality meets wishful thinking." Jessica nodded, understanding that Webb's promise was also a threat. The professional boundaries that had constrained their previous engagement were dissolving, replaced by something more primal and dangerous. But months of desert conditioning had taught her that some battles could only be won by those willing to pay any price for victory. She settled into her stance, watching Webb's approach with the analytical focus of a sniper calculating wind speed and target distance. His movement had changed, become more predatory and less controlled. The technical precision that had characterized his early instruction was being replaced by raw aggression fueled by wounded pride. The mat beneath their feet was slick with sweat and scorched by desert heat, but Jessica felt her footing was sure. Her engineering mind was already calculating angles and leverage points, analyzing Webb's new aggressive posture for weaknesses that could be exploited. As Webb closed the distance between them, Jessica realized that everything she had trained for, everything she had endured in the Arizona heat, had led to this moment. The watching soldiers, her squad mates and peers, would judge not just her individual performance, but the potential of every woman who might follow in her footsteps. The stakes could not be higher, and failure was a luxury she could not afford. Webb's size and strength were formidable, but his anger was making him careless, his desperation creating opportunities that a patient opponent could exploit with devastating effect. Jessica's hands remained loose at her sides, her breathing controlled despite the magnitude of what was approaching. She had proven that technique could overcome strength once, but doing it again against an opponent who no longer respected boundaries would require everything she had learned and more. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as two philosophies of warfare prepared to collide with consequences that neither combatant could fully anticipate. But for Jessica Chen, standing at the center of a circle that had become a coliseum, there was only one acceptable outcome: victory, achieved through perfect technique applied with surgical precision, delivered with the kind of devastating effectiveness that would silence doubt forever. The real war was about to begin. Webb's approach was different this time, predatory and calculating in ways that set every instinct Jessica possessed screaming warnings. Gone was the technical precision of a professional instructor. In its place moved something that belonged more to back-alley fights than military training. His shoulders rolled as he closed the distance, hands loose but ready, pale eyes locked on Jessica with the intensity of a hunter who had found his prey cornered. The circle of watching soldiers had unconsciously tightened, sensing that whatever was about to unfold would cross lines that formal training rarely approached. Martinez shifted nervously, his hand moving instinctively toward Jessica's discarded tactical vest, as if preparing to intervene.
Park's engineering mind was already calculating angles and force vectors, recognizing that Webb's new postures suggested capabilities beyond standard grappling techniques. "This is what you wanted," Webb said, his voice carrying across the heated rubber with casual menace. "No more kid gloves, no more pretending this is about instruction. Time to see what happens when political correctness meets biological reality." Jessica remained centered, her feet shoulder-width apart, weight distributed evenly as she'd been taught in countless hours of combatives training. But her analytical mind was working on multiple levels, processing not just Webb's physical approach, but the psychological warfare he was deploying. His words were designed to destabilize her mentally before physical contact even began. "I'm ready for whatever you think you need to prove, Sergeant," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system. Around the circle, she could feel her squadmates' tension like a physical presence, their concern and support creating an additional layer of pressure. Webb's smile was sharp as a blade. "We'll see about that." He moved with explosive speed, but not the clean linear attack Jessica had expected. Instead, Webb feinted left, then drove right, his hand seeking not the color grips of proper grappling, but the kind of clinch positions that belong to street fighting. His fingers found the back of Jessica's neck with crushing force, pulling her forward into a clinch that trapped her arms against her body. The position was legal within the loose rules they'd established, but barely. Webb's intention was clearly to overwhelm through raw physical dominance, using his size and strength to deny Jessica the technical space she needed to employ her superior knowledge. His knee drove upward, not quite striking, but threatening, a reminder that he was operating at the very edge of acceptable conduct. Jessica's response was immediate and technical. She stepped into the clinch rather than away, eliminating the distance Webb needed for his knee strikes while creating angles for her own techniques. Her hands found his elbows, controlling the joints that powered his crushing grip, while her hips moved to off-balance his base. But Webb had anticipated technical responses. As Jessica worked to counter his clinch, he shifted tactics with the fluid adaptability that marked truly dangerous opponents. His right hand drove downward, seeking to underhook her left arm and set up a takedown that would put her on the ground beneath his crushing weight. The scramble that followed was faster and more violent than anything they had exchanged previously. Both fighters worked for dominant grips while defending against their opponent's attacks, their movements becoming increasingly frantic as position and counterposition flowed like liquid mercury. Jessica found herself being driven backward, Webb's superior size forcing her to give ground as he sought to trap her against the edge of the mat. Her technical skills were keeping her in the fight, but the relentless pressure was beginning to take its toll. Sweat stung her eyes, and her breathing became labored as she fought to maintain defensive positions against overwhelming physical advantages. "This is what combat looks like," Webb grunted between attacks, his voice carrying satisfaction as he felt Jessica beginning to weaken. "No referee, no timeouts, just whoever wants it more." The watching soldiers could see the shift in momentum, Webb's aggression beginning to overwhelm Jessica's technical precision. Santos took a step forward, her instincts telling her that the demonstration was approaching dangerous territory, but Webb's next move froze her in place. He abandoned proper grappling entirely, his right hand finding Jessica's collar not for control, but to trap her while his left drove toward her face in what was unmistakably a strike. The punch pulled at the last second, stopping inches from her nose, but the message was unmistakable. "Oops," Webb said with mock concern, his voice carrying just enough volume for the watching soldiers to hear. "Adrenaline makes you do things you didn't intend. Good thing I have better control than most." The implied threat sent ripples through the circle of watchers. This was no longer about training or instruction. Webb was using his position as instructor to settle something personal and vindictive. Several soldiers exchanged glances, understanding that they were witnessing an abuse of authority disguised as professional development. Jessica felt the phantom wind of the pulled punch across her face, but her reaction was controlled and calculated.
Webb's escalation had revealed his true intentions, stripping away the pretense of professional instruction to expose something darker underneath. But it had also shown her something else. He was losing control of his emotions, making decisions based on anger rather than tactical thinking. Is that your best intimidation technique, Sergeant? Because if you're trying to make me quit, you're going to need a better strategy. Webb's pale eyes flashed with something dangerous. Intimidation? This isn't intimidation, this is education. You're about to learn why females don't belong in direct action roles. His next attack came without warning, a crude but effective takedown that used his weight advantage to drive Jessica to the mat with crushing force. They hit the rubber surface hard, Jessica's back taking the impact, while Webb's full mass settled on top of her in a position that was more pin than proper grappling.
From this position, Webb's advantages were overwhelming. His weight was distributed across Jessica's chest and shoulders, making breathing difficult while his hands controlled her wrists, preventing effective defense. The position was technically legal, but delivered with a viciousness that went far beyond instruction. "How's that technique working for you now?" Webb asked, his voice low enough that only Jessica could hear clearly. "In real combat, this is where you die. This is where all your theories about equality meet the reality of what men can do to women." Jessica's world had narrowed to the crushing weight on her chest and the burning in her lungs as she fought for each breath. But her mind remained analytical, cataloging Webb's position and searching for the weaknesses that every dominant position inevitably contained. His weight was crushing, but it was also committed, his balance dependent on maintaining the pressure that was making her struggle. She began working her escape methodically, not the desperate thrashing Webb had expected, but the systematic dismantling of his position that characterized her approach to every problem. Her right elbow found the mat, creating a frame against Webb's hip while her left hand worked to control his wrist. Webb felt the subtle shift in pressure and responded by increasing his own, driving his shoulder into Jessica's face with force that bordered on assault. "Stop struggling," he hissed. "Accept reality." But Jessica had been forged by months of desert training, conditioned to function under stress that would break lesser soldiers. The pressure Webb was applying was enormous, but it was finite, and she had learned to find strength in places most people never accessed. Her escape, when it came, was sudden and devastating. Jessica's right elbow drove into the mat as her hips bridged explosively, creating space and leverage where none had existed. Her left hand, which Webb had dismissed as controlled, found his collar and pulled with every ounce of strength her conditioning had built. The combination of bridge and pull sent Webb tumbling forward, his carefully maintained position collapsing as physics took over. Jessica rolled with the momentum, her movement flowing like water as she transitioned from defensive to offensive positioning. She came up behind Webb, her arms snaking around his throat in what could have been a rear naked choke if she had chosen to apply it. Instead, she controlled his posture without cutting off his air, demonstrating technical superiority while maintaining the professional boundaries Webb had abandoned. "Yield," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough volume for Webb to hear.
His response was immediate and explosive. Webb drove backward with his full weight, trying to crush Jessica against the mat behind them. The movement was crude but effective, using his size to create damage rather than seeking technical dominance. Jessica absorbed the impact and maintained her position, her arm adjusting to counter Webb's attempts to escape. Her legs wrapped around his waist, controlling his hips and preventing the powerful bucking movements he was attempting. The position was completely dominant, Jessica's technical skill having once again neutralized Webb's physical advantages. Around the mat, soldiers watched in amazement as their female squad mate systematically dismantled someone who outweighed her by nearly 100 pounds. But Webb's desperation was reaching dangerous levels. Professional pride, personal worldview, and raw ego combined into something toxic that refused to accept the reality of his situation. Instead of yielding gracefully, he made a decision that would cross every line of professional conduct and personal decency. His right elbow drove backward with malicious intent, aimed not at Jessica's body but at her face. The strike was designed to cause injury, to end the fight through damage rather than technique. It was the action of someone who had abandoned all pretense of instruction in favor of personal vendetta. Jessica saw the elbow coming with the clarity that came from months of training under stress. Her response was instinctive, releasing her choke attempt to defend against the strike. But in doing so, she created the opening Webb had been desperately seeking. He rolled forward explosively, his weight carrying him out of Jessica's control and back to his feet with the desperate energy of someone who knew his professional reputation hung in the balance. As he stood, his face was flushed with exertion and something that looked disturbingly like rage. "Had enough yet?" he asked, his breathing labored, but his voice carried renewed confidence. "Ready to admit that all the training in the world can't overcome basic biology?" Jessica climbed to her feet, her movement controlled despite the battering she had absorbed. Her uniform was soaked with sweat and darkened with dust from the mat, but her posture remained straight and professional. Around the circle, her squad mates watched with growing concern as the demonstration devolved into something more personal and dangerous. "I'm ready to continue until one of us yields properly," she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was facing. Webb's smile was predatory. "Properly? Let me tell you what proper looks like in real combat." He moved closer, his posture shifting into something that belonged more to predators than instructor. "Proper is whatever it takes to stay alive. Proper is using every advantage you have against an enemy who wants you dead."
The watching soldiers sensed the shift in Webb's demeanor, the way his professional mask had finally slipped completely away. Martinez took a step forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his gear, but Santos caught his arm with a gesture that told him to hold position. Jessica understood that whatever came next would determine not just the outcome of their confrontation, but the broader questions about capability and equality that had brought them to this point. Webb's escalation had stripped away all pretense, leaving only the raw conflict between worldviews that could not coexist. She centered herself on the mat, feeling the heat radiating up through the rubber into her boots. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, but her focus was absolute, concentrated on the opponent who had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous than a simple training instructor. Webb was preparing something. She could see it in his posture, in the way his hands moved in preparation for an attack that would cross every remaining boundary. Whatever he planned would be designed not just to defeat her, but to humiliate her in front of the soldiers whose respect she had spent months earning. But Jessica Chen had not survived the crucible of Fort Valdez to be broken by someone who confused brutality with strength. As Webb prepared his final assault, she prepared her own response, one that would demonstrate the difference between technique applied with precision and force applied with malice. The desert air shimmered with heat and tension as two philosophies of warfare prepared for a collision that would leave only one standing. And in that crystalline moment before violence erupted, Jessica knew with absolute certainty that she would emerge victorious no matter the cost. Webb's final assault came with the fury of someone whose entire worldview hung in the balance. He abandoned all pretense of technique, charging across the mat with the desperate aggression of a cornered animal. His hands reached not for proper grappling grips, but for Jessica's throat, fingers spread wide to crush rather than control. The movement was crude, telegraphed, and driven by emotion rather than tactical thinking. Jessica saw the attack coming with crystalline clarity, her mind processing the multiple vectors of threat with the precision of a targeting computer. Webb's rage had made him predictable, his desperate need to dominate overriding the technical training that had made him dangerous. In his fury, he had given her exactly what she needed, a committed attack that would leave him vulnerable to the perfect counter. As Webb's hands reached for her neck, Jessica stepped into the attack rather than away, her movement fluid and economical. Her left hand caught his right wrist while her right found his elbow, controlling the arm that carried the most immediate threat. But instead of working for a standard arm drag or hip toss, her engineering mind had calculated something more devastating.
Webb's momentum carried him forward, his full weight committed to the throttling attack he had intended. Jessica used that momentum like a lever, stepping to her right while maintaining perfect control of his attacking arm. The movement was simple in theory, a basic arm drag combined with a leg sweep,
but her execution transformed it into something approaching art. Her right leg swept behind Webb's left knee at the exact moment his weight was transitioning forward, disrupting his base while her arm control prevented him from adjusting. Physics took over with mathematical precision, Webb's 220-pound frame becoming a projectile governed by momentum and gravity. But Jessica wasn't finished. As Webb began to fall, she maintained her grip on his controlled arm while stepping through with her left leg. The movement was called an arm drag to single-leg takedown in technical terminology, but what happened next transcended any formal classification. Webb hit the mat hard, his left leg trapped beneath his body, while Jessica maintained control of his right arm above. The position was unstable by design, putting enormous stress on Webb's trapped leg as his full weight settled onto the joint. His femur, the strongest bone in the human body, suddenly found itself supporting not just his weight, but the additional torque created by the awkward angle. The sound that followed would haunt every soldier present for the rest of their military careers. The crack was sharp and wet, like a tree branch snapping in a windstorm, but with an organic quality that immediately identified it as something far more serious. Webb's femur, stressed beyond its breaking point by the combination of his weight, the angle of impact, and the rotational force Jessica had applied, fractured completely just above the knee. But this wasn't a clean break that might heal with proper treatment. The force of the impact and Webb's continuing momentum drove the broken bone through the muscle and skin of his thigh, the sharp end of his femur emerging through his ACU trousers in a fountain of bright arterial blood. Webb's scream tore across the training area like a siren, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. It was the cry of someone whose body had just informed him that his life had fundamentally changed, that the strength and physical dominance he had built his identity around had been shattered along with his bone. Jessica released her grips immediately, stepping back from Webb's writhing form with the controlled movement of someone whose training had prepared her for the aftermath of violence. Her face was calm, professional, showing none of the satisfaction or horror that might have been expected. She had applied technique with precision, and the result was exactly what physics and anatomy had dictated.
Around the circle, soldiers reacted with varying degrees of shock and amazement. Martinez stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as he processed what he had just witnessed. Park, his engineering mind automatically calculating the forces involved, actually took a step backward as if distance might somehow reduce the reality of what had occurred. Torres dropped to her knees and began retching, the sight and sound of Webb's compound fracture overwhelming her nervous system despite months of military conditioning. Washington turned away completely, her hand pressed to her mouth as she fought her own physiological responses. But it was Santos who reacted first with practical authority, her 15 years of military experience overriding the shock that held others paralyzed. "Medic," she shouted, her voice cutting through Webb's continuing screams. "Compound fracture, arterial bleeding, move." Webb lay on the mat in a spreading pool of his own blood, his left leg twisted at an angle that defied anatomy. The white of his fractured femur protruded through torn camouflage like an accusation, while his face had gone gray with shock and pain. But worse than the physical trauma was the sound he was making. Not just screams of pain, but sobs of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had been demolished. "It hurts," he gasped between sobs, his voice high and breaking like a child's. "Oh God, it hurts so much. Please, somebody help me, please." The tears streaming down his face mixed with the dust and sweat of combat, creating muddy tracks that spoke of complete psychological collapse. The man who had dominated through size and aggression, who had built his identity on physical supremacy, was reduced to begging for relief from pain he had brought upon himself. Jessica stood over him, her uniform soaked with sweat, but her posture straight and controlled. She watched Webb's agony with the dispassionate attention of someone observing the results of a scientific experiment. Around her, the circle of soldiers struggled to process what they had witnessed, not just the devastating injury, but the complete reversal of expected outcome. "Real soldiers don't cry," Webb had said less than an hour earlier, his voice full of contempt and certainty. Now those words seemed to echo from the desert air itself, a judgment that had found its target with devastating accuracy. Jessica looked down at Webb's tear-streaked face, at the sobs that racked his powerful frame, and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who'd proven every point that needed proving. "You're right, Sergeant," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the training area. "They don't."
The words fell into the desert silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond Fort Valdez. Every soldier present understood they had witnessed something more than a training accident. They had seen the definitive answer to questions about strength, capability, and what it truly meant to be a warrior. Medics arrived with the controlled urgency that marked military medical professionals, their equipment and expertise immediately deployed to address Webb's catastrophic injury. The senior medic, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, took one look at the compound fracture and immediately began barking orders to his team. "Start 2 IVs, get me a pressure bandage for the arterial bleeding, and call for helicopter evacuation," Rodriguez commanded, his hands already working to stabilize Webb's shattered leg. "This is going straight to trauma surgery at Phoenix General." The medical response was swift and professional, but nothing could address the psychological trauma that went beyond physical injury. Webb continued to sob as medics worked on him, his cries echoing off the barracks walls like a lament for lost certainty. Jessica stepped aside to give the medics room to work, her movement bringing her closer to her squadmates, who regarded her with a mixture of awe and concern. Martinez was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jesus, Jesse, how did you... where did that come from?" Jessica's response was matter-of-fact, delivered in the same tone she might use to explain a mechanical procedure. Lever and fulcrum, basic physics. He committed his weight to an unbalanced attack, and his leg couldn't handle the stress when he landed. Park nodded slowly, his engineering background allowing him to appreciate the technical precision of what he had witnessed. "You calculated that? The angle, the leverage point, the amount of force his femur could absorb? You engineered his injury?" "I defended myself," Jessica corrected, but her tone carried no apology. "He escalated beyond training parameters. The result was predictable based on the forces involved." Santos approached, her expression unreadable as she processed the implications of what had occurred under her supervision. "Chen, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Jessica performed a quick self-assessment, checking for impacts or strains she might not have immediately noticed in the adrenaline of combat. "No, Sergeant, I'm fully mission capable." The phrase carried weight that extended beyond its literal meaning. Jessica was not just physically unharmed, but professionally vindicated, her capability demonstrated in ways that could never be questioned or dismissed. She had not simply survived Webb's assault, she had ended it with decisive, devastating effectiveness. As medics loaded Webb onto a stretcher, his sobs gradually quieting under the influence of pain medication, Jessica became aware of the broader audience that had gathered. Soldiers from other training areas had been drawn by the commotion, their faces reflecting varying degrees of shock, admiration, and concern. Word was already spreading through the compound, carried by whispers and text messages that would ensure the story reached every corner of Fort Valdez within hours. Jessica Chen, the quiet engineer from UCLA who had survived every challenge the desert could present, had just redefined what strength looked like in the modern military. Colonel Morrison, the base commander, arrived as Webb was being loaded into the medical helicopter that would carry him to advanced trauma care. His presence brought immediate attention to order, soldiers snapping to positions of respect as the senior officer surveyed the scene. Morrison was a career infantry officer whose own path through Ranger School and multiple combat deployments had taught him to recognize exceptional soldiers regardless of their background or demographics. His gray eyes swept the training area, taking in the blood-stained mat, the watching soldiers, and Jessica's composed posture. "Sergeant Santos, report," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of leadership. Santos provided a concise summary of the training demonstration, her professional tone masking the complexity of what had actually occurred. She described Webb's escalation, Jessica's defensive responses, and the accident that had resulted in catastrophic injury. Morrison listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Santos finished, his attention turned to Jessica with the focused intensity she had learned to expect from senior leaders. "Private Chen, are you prepared to provide a statement regarding this incident?" Jessica's response was immediate and professional. "Yes, sir. I defended myself within established training parameters when Sergeant Webb's conduct exceeded professional boundaries. The injury was an unintended consequence of proper defensive technique applied under duress." Morrison nodded slowly, his assessment including not just Jessica's words, but her demeanor, her composure in the aftermath of violence, and the obvious respect she commanded from her peers. His next words would be remembered by everyone present. "Private Chen, you will report to my office at 0800 tomorrow for a complete debrief. Until then, you are to consider yourself relieved of all training duties pending investigation." He paused, letting the formal language settle, before adding something more personal. "Outstanding work, soldier. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of warrior mindset this army needs."
The colonel's endorsement rippled through the assembled soldiers like electricity, official recognition that Jessica's actions had been not just justified, but exemplary. She had faced a test that went beyond normal training parameters and emerged victorious through skill, conditioning, and unshakable determination. As the medical helicopter lifted off, carrying Webb towards surgery that would save his leg but never restore his broken confidence, Jessica stood among her squad mates in the desert heat. The training mat where their confrontation had unfolded was still stained with blood, a reminder of what happened when technique met brute force in direct competition. The demonstration that had begun with questions about female capability had ended with definitive answers written in shattered bone and shed tears. Jessica had proven that strength came in forms that could not be measured by conventional standards, that engineering precision could be more devastating than raw power. But more than that, she had shown every soldier present that the measure of a warrior was not determined by size or gender, but by the willingness to do whatever was necessary to complete the mission and protect those who depended on them. The desert sun continued its relentless assault on Fort Valdez, but in the shade of the training area, Jessica Chen stood vindicated and victorious, surrounded by soldiers who would never again question what she was capable of achieving. The fracture that had ended Webb's dominance had also broken through barriers that had existed since the beginning of military history, clearing the path for a future where capability would be judged by results rather than assumptions. In the growing heat of the Arizona afternoon, that future looked very bright indeed. The investigation began before Webb's helicopter had cleared the Fort Valdez airspace. By 1400 hours, less than 2 hours after the compound fracture had painted the training mat with arterial spray, Colonel Morrison's office had become a command center, buzzing with the controlled urgency that characterized military crisis management. Legal officers, training supervisors, and medical personnel filed through his door in steady succession, each carrying pieces of a puzzle that would determine not just Jessica's fate, but the future of combatives training throughout the Army. Jessica sat in the small conference room adjacent to Morrison's office, her ACUs now cleaned and pressed, the blood and dust of combat replaced by the crisp appearance expected of a soldier under official scrutiny. She had showered and changed after providing her initial statement, but the adrenaline of the morning's events still coursed through her system like low-voltage electricity. Her hands remained steady on the polished oak table, but her mind continued processing the technical sequence that had ended Webb's career with surgical precision. Captain Sarah Lynch, the base legal officer, entered with a thick folder and the measured demeanor of someone accustomed to separating legal reality from emotional interpretation. Lynch was a former prosecutor whose transition to military law had been motivated by a desire to serve something larger than courtroom victories. Her auburn hair was pulled back in regulation style, framing a face that had learned to project authority despite her relatively small stature. "Private Chen," Lynch began, settling into the chair across from Jessica with practiced efficiency, "I need to walk through the events of this morning in detail. Everything you say will be recorded and may be used in subsequent proceedings." Jessica nodded, understanding that her next words could determine whether she faced charges or commendation. "I understand, ma'am." Lynch activated a digital recorder and placed it between them, its red light creating a small pool of electronic attention. "Let's start with Sergeant Webb's conduct during the initial phase of training. Did you observe any behavior that exceeded normal instructional parameters?" The questions continued for 90 minutes, Lynch methodically building a timeline that would withstand scrutiny from higher headquarters, media attention, and the inevitable political controversy that surrounded women in combat roles. Jessica's responses were precise and professional, her engineering background evident in the way she described angles, forces, and the mechanical principles that had transformed defensive technique into devastating injury. "When you executed the takedown that resulted in Sergeant Webb's fracture," Lynch asked, "did you intend to cause injury?" Jessica's response was immediate and unwavering. "No, ma'am. I intended to neutralize a threat using appropriate defensive technique. The severity of the resulting injury was determined by physics and anatomy, not intent." Lynch made notes in shorthand that would later be transcribed into official reports destined for Pentagon briefing rooms. "Would you characterize Sergeant Webb's conduct as professional throughout the training exercise?" "No, ma'am," Jessica replied, without hesitation. "Sergeant Webb escalated beyond training parameters, used intimidation techniques inappropriate for instruction, and ultimately attempted to inflict injury rather than demonstrate technique." The legal officer's pen moved steadily across her notepad, capturing testimony that would form the foundation of official findings. But beyond the formal investigation, Lynch was documenting something more significant: evidence of systemic problems in how female soldiers were treated by certain instructors who confused personal prejudice with professional standards.
As the afternoon progressed, other soldiers were interviewed in adjacent rooms. Martinez provided emotional testimony about Webb's inappropriate comments regarding female capabilities. Park described the technical precision of Jessica's defensive techniques with the analytical language that carried weight with investigating officers. Santos detailed the escalation she had witnessed, her 15 years of experience lending credibility to observations that painted Webb's conduct as unprofessional and dangerous. The most damaging testimony came from Specialist Torres, whose quiet voice carried devastating impact as she described Webb's threats and intimidation tactics. Her account revealed a pattern of behavior that went far beyond a single training incident, suggesting that Webb had used his position to target female soldiers with systematic harassment disguised as professional development. By 1700 hours, Colonel Morrison had assembled a complete picture of the morning's events, supplemented by witness statements, medical reports, and video footage from security cameras that had captured portions of the confrontation. The evidence was overwhelming in its support of Jessica's actions and damning in its indictment of Webb's conduct. Morrison reviewed the accumulated documentation in his office as the desert sun began its descent toward the western mountains. At 52, he had commanded troops in 3 combat deployments and witnessed the evolution of military culture from an organization that excluded women from direct combat to one still struggling to integrate them effectively. The Chen incident represented everything both right and wrong with that ongoing transformation. His intercom crackled with the voice of his aide, Lieutenant Harris. "Sir, General Patterson's office is on line 1. He wants to discuss the training incident." Morrison lifted the secure phone that connected him directly to the commanding general of the entire training command, knowing that Webb's injury had already attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership. "Jim," General Patterson's voice carried the weight of 3 decades in uniform. "I need to know what the hell happened out there. I've got Pentagon liaisons asking questions, and the media is starting to sniff around." Morrison provided a concise summary of the investigation findings, his report painting Jessica as a soldier who had defended herself professionally while Webb had violated every principle of proper instruction. Patterson listened without interruption, his silence indicating the gravity with which he viewed the situation. "The female soldier, Chen, what's your assessment of her conduct and capabilities?" "Outstanding soldier, sir. Exceptional technical skills, superior conditioning, and exactly the kind of warrior mindset we need in today's army. Her actions were completely justified and professionally executed."
Patterson's next words carried implications that would echo throughout the military. "Then we need to make sure this incident becomes a teaching moment about what right looks like, not a cautionary tale about integration failures. I want a complete investigation, but I also wanted clear that exceptional soldiers will be supported regardless of demographics." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, touching on policy implications, media strategy, and the broader challenges of cultural evolution within traditional military structures. When Morrison hung up, he understood that Jessica's confrontation with Webb had become more than a training incident. It was a watershed moment that would influence how the Army approached gender integration for years to come. Meanwhile, word of the morning's events had spread throughout Fort Valdez with the velocity that characterized military gossip networks. Soldiers gathered in mess halls and barracks, their conversations dominated by eyewitness accounts and second-hand details that grew more dramatic with each retelling. The basic facts remained consistent. Private Chen had shattered Staff Sergeant Webb's leg after he had crossed professional boundaries. But the interpretations varied dramatically. In the female barracks, the reaction was electric. Specialist Amanda Foster, who had endured months of subtle harassment from male instructors, found herself walking straighter, speaking louder, carrying herself with new confidence. "She did what we've all wanted to do," Foster told her roommate, her voice carrying satisfaction that went beyond the specific incident. Private Lisa Chang, one of only 12 female soldiers in the Advanced Combat Training Program, felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to lift from her shoulders. "Nobody's going to question whether we belong here anymore," she said, understanding that Jessica's technical demonstration had settled debates that had raged since women had been authorized for direct combat roles. But the reaction wasn't universally positive. In certain corners of the base, soldiers who had shared Webb's attitudes toward female integration viewed Jessica's victory with resentment and concern. Staff Sergeant Mike Coleman, a contemporary of Webb's with similar views, gathered his supporters in private conversations that questioned the investigation's findings and suggested that political pressure had influenced official conclusions. "Webb's career is over," Coleman said, his voice low but carrying conviction. 15 years of service, multiple deployments, proven combat record, all destroyed because he pushed back against this social engineering experiment. These whispered dissents found little traction among the broader soldier population, but they represented undercurrents that would take years to fully address. Cultural change in military organizations moved slowly, and Jessica's victory, while decisive, hadn't eliminated the attitudes that had created the confrontation in the first place.
As evening approached, Jessica returned to her barracks to find her personal space transformed into something approaching a shrine. Cards, notes, and small gifts had appeared on her footlocker, placed there by female soldiers from across the base, who viewed her as a symbol of possibilities they had barely dared to imagine. "You changed everything," read one note from a soldier Jessica had never met. "My daughter will grow up knowing that women can be warriors too."
Another message, written in Spanish and English, came from Private Maria Santos, daughter of Jessica's squad leader. You proved that respect is earned through actions, not given because of assumptions. Jessica read each message carefully, understanding that her personal victory had become public vindication for every female soldier who had ever been told she didn't belong in combat arms. The weight of that symbolic burden was both inspiring and daunting, a responsibility she had never sought but couldn't now avoid. Her squad mates treated her differently now, not with the casual familiarity of shared hardship, but with something approaching reverence. Martinez knocked before entering her area, his usual easy demeanor replaced by formal respect. Park spoke to her with the careful precision reserved for discussing technical matters with recognized experts. Only Torres seemed unchanged, approaching Jessica's bunk with the same direct honesty that had characterized their friendship since training began. "How are you really doing?" Torres asked, her voice low enough to avoid other years. "I keep replaying the sequence, analyzing whether I could have achieved the same result with less injury to Webb. The engineering part of my brain wants to optimize the technique for future applications." Torres smiled, recognizing the analytical approach that defined Jessica's personality. "And the soldier part of your brain?" "The soldier part knows that sometimes you have to break things completely to fix them properly," Jessica replied, understanding that her confrontation with Webb had shattered more than just bone and career. It had fractured assumptions that had limited military effectiveness for generations. The conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Santos, who approached with an official bearing that indicated formal business. "Chen, Colonel Morrison wants to see you in his office at 2000 hours, dress uniform, full decorations." Jessica understood immediately that this was not another investigative interview, but something more significant. Evening appointments with senior commanders, particularly those requiring dress uniforms, typically involved formal recognition or assignment changes that would alter a soldier's career trajectory. As she prepared her Class A uniform, Jessica reflected on the morning that had transformed her from a competent soldier working to prove herself into a symbol of changing military culture. Webb's compound fracture had become her breakthrough moment, but she understood that the real test would be how she handled the expectations and responsibilities that came with unwanted celebrity. The desert evening was cooling as Jessica walked across the base toward Colonel Morrison's office, her dress uniform crisp in the dry air, her decorations catching light from security fixtures that illuminated the compound. Behind her, Fort Valdez continued its relentless cycle of training and preparation, but she knew that tomorrow would bring changes that would echo far beyond the Arizona desert. In trauma surgery at Phoenix General Hospital, Webb lay sedated while surgeons worked to reconstruct the leg that Jessica's technique had shattered. His military career was effectively over, his assumptions about strength and capability broken as completely as his femur. But his injury had become the foundation for someone else's triumph, the necessary sacrifice that cleared the path for a new understanding of what warriors could look like. Jessica approached Morrison's office knowing that whatever waited inside would determine not just her immediate future, but the trajectory of changes that would define military culture for the next generation. The confrontation that had begun with Webb's arrogant challenge had evolved into something much larger, and she was prepared to meet whatever responsibilities that evolution demanded. The compound fracture had been completed, but the healing process was just beginning. Colonel Morrison's office had been transformed into an impromptu ceremony space when Jessica arrived at precisely 2000 hours. The usual military efficiency was supplemented by touches that suggested significance beyond routine recognition. A small podium had been positioned near Morrison's desk. American and Army flags flanked the space, and a photographer from the base public affairs office waited discreetly in the corner. More telling was the presence of General Patterson himself, who had flown down from Fort Bragg specifically for this occasion. At 58, Patterson commanded the Army's entire Advanced Individual Training Enterprise, responsible for the education of over 200,000 soldiers annually.
His presence at Fort Valdez indicated that Jessica's confrontation with Webb had attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership. Jessica entered and reported with textbook precision, her dress uniform immaculate, her bearing professional, despite the magnitude of what was clearly a career-defining moment. Morrison returned her salute and gestured toward the small group assembled in his office.
"Private Chen," General Patterson began, his voice carrying the authority that came from 3 decades of leading soldiers in peace and war. "What happened on that training mat yesterday morning has been analyzed by some of the finest military minds in our Army. The conclusion is unanimous. Your actions represent exactly the kind of warrior ethos we need in today's military." Patterson moved to stand directly in front of Jessica, his presence commanding yet approving. "Staff Sergeant Webb's conduct violated every principle of professional instruction and military leadership. Your response demonstrated technical excellence, tactical soundness, and the kind of controlled aggression that defines elite soldiers." The general paused, letting his words settle before continuing. "More importantly, you maintained your composure and professionalism throughout an encounter that would have broken lesser soldiers. You proved that strength comes in forms that can't be measured by conventional metrics." Colonel Morrison stepped forward, carrying a folder that Jessica recognized as containing official military documents. "Private First Class Chen, by order of the commanding general, you are hereby promoted to the rank of specialist, effective immediately." The promotion was significant not just for its recognition value, but for its timing. Jessica had been at Fort Valdez for only 4 months, and advancement to specialist typically required a full year of service. The accelerated promotion sent a clear message about how her performance was viewed by senior leadership. But Patterson wasn't finished. "Specialist Chen, I'm also pleased to inform you that you've been selected for immediate assignment to the Military Police Corps' Combatives Training Center at Fort Leonard Wood. You'll serve as a primary instructor responsible for training the next generation of military police officers in advanced hand-to-hand combat techniques." The assignment represented a quantum leap in responsibility and recognition. The Combatives Training Center was staffed by elite soldiers whose expertise was recognized throughout the military. For a 22-year-old specialist with less than 2 years of service to receive such an assignment was unprecedented. "Additionally," Patterson continued, "you'll be attending the Advanced Individual Training Instructor course, followed by specialized training in biomechanics and injury prevention at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. The Army is investing in your development because we believe you represent the future of military combatives instruction." Jessica processed the information with the analytical mind that had served her throughout her military career. The assignments represented not just personal advancement, but institutional change. She was being positioned to influence how the entire Army approached hand-to-hand combat training. "Sir," Jessica replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was accepting, "I'm honored by this opportunity and ready to serve wherever the Army needs me."
Patterson smiled, recognizing the professionalism that had made Jessica's victory over Webb so impressive. "There's one more thing, Specialist. This incident has generated significant interest from defense policymakers, military researchers, and media representatives. You'll likely be asked to participate in interviews, congressional briefings, and policy discussions about women in combat roles." The general's expression became more serious. "This attention comes with responsibility. You've become a symbol of capability and change, whether you sought that role or not. How you handle that symbolism will influence military culture for years to come." Jessica understood the weight of what Patterson was describing. Her personal confrontation with Webb had evolved into something much larger, a case study in gender integration,
a demonstration of technical superiority over physical dominance, and a catalyst for institutional transformation. The photographer documented the promotion ceremony with flashes that seemed to punctuate each moment of recognition. These images would appear in military publications, policy documents, and training materials, ensuring that Jessica's story would be preserved as part of military history. As the formal ceremony concluded, Patterson pulled Jessica aside for a private conversation. "Specialist, I want you to understand what really happened out there. Webb represented attitudes and assumptions that have limited our military's effectiveness for generations. Your victory wasn't just personal, it was institutional." The general's words carried weight that extended far beyond individual recognition. "We're facing threats that require every capable soldier, regardless of gender, race, or background. What you demonstrated is that capability comes in forms we haven't always recognized or valued." Patterson handed Jessica a thick folder containing her new assignment orders, training schedules, and background materials. "Your new position will put you at the forefront of changing how we train soldiers. The techniques you used, the principles you applied, they need to be studied, refined, and taught to others." Jessica accepted the folder, understanding that its contents represented not just her future, but the transformation of military combatives training. "Sir, what about Sergeant Webb? What's his status?" Patterson's expression became grave. "Webb's military career is over. Medical retirement due to his injuries, with additional administrative action for conduct unbecoming. His security clearance has been revoked, and he'll never hold a position of authority over soldiers again." The general paused, considering his next words carefully. "But here's what's important. Webb's failure became your triumph. His inability to adapt to changing military culture created the opportunity for you to demonstrate what adaptation looks like."
As Jessica prepared to leave Morrison's office, Torres appeared in the hallway with a small group of female soldiers from across the base. They had come to witness her departure, understanding that her success represented possibilities they had never dared to imagine. "You did something none of us could do," Specialist Foster said, her voice carrying emotion that went beyond professional respect. "You proved that we belong here, that we can excel here, that technique and determination matter more than size and intimidation." Private Chang stepped forward with a small American flag that had been signed by every female soldier at Fort Valdez. "This is for you to remember us when you're training the next generation. Remember that you changed everything for all of us." Jessica accepted the flag with the solemnity appropriate for such a meaningful gift. These soldiers represented the real victory, not just her personal triumph over Webb, but the broader transformation of expectations and possibilities for women in military service. The following morning brought news that Webb's compound fracture had required multiple surgeries to repair. Surgeons at Phoenix General had managed to save his leg, but permanent nerve damage would leave him with a pronounced limp and chronic pain. The injury that had ended his military career would follow him for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of the day his assumptions about strength had been shattered along with his bone. More significantly, the Army's investigation had uncovered a pattern of inappropriate conduct that extended far beyond his confrontation with Jessica. Other female soldiers came forward with testimonies of harassment, intimidation, and unprofessional behavior that painted Webb as someone who had systematically abused his position to target women he deemed unworthy of military service. The investigation's findings resulted in policy changes that rippled throughout the training command. New protocols were established for combatives instruction, supervision requirements were enhanced, and reporting procedures were streamlined to ensure that inappropriate conduct could be identified and addressed before it escalated to violence. 6 months later, Jessica stood in front of her first class at the Combatives Training Center, looking out at 40 military police officers who had come to learn advanced techniques from someone whose expertise had been proven under the most demanding circumstances. The students included both men and women, but Jessica's presence had fundamentally altered the dynamic of military combatives training. Combat is about problem-solving under stress. Size and strength are tools, but they're not the most important tools. Intelligence, technique, and determination will overcome raw physical advantages every time.
Her teaching methodology incorporated lessons learned not just from her confrontation with Webb, but from the months of analysis and refinement that had followed. She had studied biomechanics, consulted with medical professionals, and developed training protocols that maximized effectiveness while minimizing injury risk. The techniques she taught were grounded in scientific principles rather than traditional assumptions about what worked in combat. Her students learned to calculate angles, apply leverage, and use an opponent's size and aggression against them with mathematical precision. 1 year after the incident at Fort Valdez, Jessica received notification that she had been selected for Officer Candidate School, with guaranteed assignment to military intelligence following commissioning. The Army was investing in her intellectual capabilities as much as her physical skills, recognizing that the future of military effectiveness lay in soldiers who could think as well as fight. Her final letter from Fort Valdez came from an unexpected source, Santos, who had been promoted to Sergeant First Class and assigned as the senior combatives instructor for the entire training command. "You changed everything," Santos wrote. "Not just for women, but for everyone. You proved that the best soldier isn't necessarily the biggest or strongest. It's the smartest and most determined." The letter included news that Webb had been arrested for assault at a civilian bar, his inability to cope with his diminished status having led to increasingly destructive behavior. His military retirement had been reduced to disability payments, and his attempts to find civilian employment had been hampered by the publicity surrounding his confrontation with Jessica. But Webb's downfall was overshadowed by the success of those who had learned from Jessica's example. Female soldiers throughout the Army carried themselves with new confidence, understanding that capability would be judged by performance rather than assumptions. Male soldiers had learned to evaluate their peers based on actual abilities rather than demographic characteristics. The training mat at Fort Valdez, where Jessica had shattered Webb's leg and career, had become something of a legend within military combative circles. New students were told the story of the 120-pound engineer who had defeated a 220-pound ranger through superior technique and unshakable determination. More importantly, the incident had become a case study taught at the Army War College, analyzed by military sociologists, and referenced in congressional testimony about the effectiveness of gender integration in combat roles. Jessica's victory had provided concrete evidence that diversity strengthened rather than weakened military capability. 5 years after the compound fracture heard around Fort Valdez, Lieutenant Jessica Chen commanded a military intelligence unit deployed to Eastern Europe, where her analytical skills and combat expertise had proven invaluable in training Allied forces. She had completed her engineering degree through military education programs and was pursuing advanced study in biomechanics and tactical psychology.
Her units were consistently rated among the top performers in their mission areas, staffed by soldiers who had been selected based on capability rather than demographics. The culture Jessica had helped create emphasized excellence over assumptions, results over prejudices. Webb, meanwhile, had faded into obscurity, his name associated only with failure and the kind of outdated thinking that had been purged from modern military culture. His compound fracture had become a cautionary tale about what happened when institutional prejudice confronted individual excellence. But for Jessica, the confrontation that had defined her early military career had become simply one chapter in a story of continuous growth and achievement.
She had proven that real soldiers didn't cry when faced with adversity. They adapted, evolved, and changed the world one perfect technique at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.